Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement, join us to discuss Islamists versus Muslim Reformists, how the battle has evolved since 9/11. Dr. Jasser will speak for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Thank you. It's great to be with all of you, and it's always an honor to work with the Middle East Forum and be a partner with all of you in the work that we do. I also want to wish my Jewish brothers and sisters a blessed New Year and a coming Yom Kippur. So God bless you all on your holiday. This topic is obviously near and dear to my heart. It's been the focus of our work about, what are the painful lessons for us reformers who have been pushing uphill against political Islam and the Islamists within the House of Islam. And as we would say in Arabic, it's yalla, where's the results? And I'm going to take a few minutes to go through what are the current trends since 9/11 and how does that inform our future strategies. I think, as all of you know, 9/11 exposed via Al-Qaeda and subsequently then a decade later through ISIS, the true agenda of the Islamists. The Muslim Brotherhood types, the civilizational jihadists, were quite upset with the militant arms of their movements because it exposed what their mission was, which was to destroy the influence of the West and get them out of their hemisphere, let alone out of their influence. And we have now seen the Arab awakening and its impact, and I think we're able to make some conclusions about the battle within the House of Islam, not only within Muslim majority countries, but also where the West is and what progress or lack of progress we've made. First, I think, to be fair, there were many prescient leaders, starting with Bernard Lewis with his book "What Went Wrong" and so much other of his scholarship, and also with Dr. Pipes and your organization's focus on political Islam and Islamism, and that obviously a reformed, moderate Islam couched in modernity is part of the solution, but obviously political Islam and the Islamic State concept is the problem. But while you all have the diagnosis correct, the treatment has been in our court within the House of Islam, and why haven't we gotten further? I think successes-wise, I am very proud of the fact that those of us in the anti-jihad movement from the Muslim and non-Muslim perspective have been able to shift the discourse to being about political Islam. Islamism is no longer a dirty word. It's no longer a word that's avoided. Political Islam is seen as incompatible with Western ideas. And I think that has been a resounding success as far as education of the West and shifting where we are. Let me go through a few assumptions we've made back early on. Our organization now is going on its 15th year in formality. But the first 3 or 4 years were informing what we were doing. And then in 2010 on, we hit the ground running. And why haven't we made success? I think, let me go through some assumptions. First of all, our assumption was that if you build it, they will come. And the build it part is about institutions, academia, a religious identity outside the mosque, about a movement, about a voice in media. That's the it part. And we did build it. We do have leaders within our Muslim Reform movement, but the joining part has not happened. And I think bottom line, that's wrong. And I will tell you why we were wrong about that assumption in a bit. The second assumption was that Muslims will feel an ownership of Islam and want to marginalize the Islamists. I think that's been proven to be right, in that the demonstrations, especially in the Arab awakening and elsewhere, have rejected Islamism initially, but the Islamists proved to be more organized. So again, I think we were right on that assumption, but wrong on the motivation, especially for Muslims in the West, to marginalize Islamists. So again, the sense of ownership is there, but the fire under their feet, the sense of urgency has also been miscalculated on our part. The assumptions that the West would form natural coalitions with non-Islamists, with those who believe in liberty, who believe in modernity. That assumption was not only wrong, but we miscalculated the force of the headwinds for identity politics, for that merger between the red-green axis, in which we see now what's left of the Islamist movement that is still functional and moving full force ahead, is really working in tandem. So we did not see that, neither did most of the political movements in the West see what happened with the far left and its progressivist success, whether it be through Black Lives Matter, the critical race theory movements, and the destruction of what are the foundations of Western civilization, and how Islamists would be working with that. So last, we had assumed that Islamist failures would translate into our own successes. That ultimately, I think, is the greatest hope we have, is that I can point out, and I will point out, the failures of Islamists and how they are beginning to turn their sights internally rather than externally, and that's why they're less in conflict with us in the non-Islamist or anti-Islamist world, because they're too busy fighting within each other. But at the end of the day, the process in which there'd be a replacement while there's a supply of anti-Islamists, the demand for them, it has really driven Muslims away from Islam. It has driven Muslims away from organized Islam, and some even to leave the faith, which has, I think, in some ways is a point of success, in that when the urgency will come, when Muslims realize that their faith is at stake and people are leaving the faith that they love. But that's much more methodical than we thought. It's not happening by turning on a dime, and they're not turning around and having a populist movement against the Islamists. So let's talk about the successes that I think you should all be aware of, having looked at those assumptions and that have been proven wrong. So the successes, obviously, normalization of the use of the term Islamism, the losses of the Islamists, as I mentioned briefly in the Arab Awakening, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and how quickly their control turned into a mass movement against them. The ISIS's and radical movements in Syria and Iraq have also proven to estrange the masses in general. And obviously in Iran, which we see just in the past few weeks now with the Green Revolution that had started in 2009, and now we're starting to see the first time that, and across the Middle East, that you have men standing with women protesting the hijab and control of their bodily and physical autonomy. And also in Turkey. Turkey initially had a huge uptick in Islamist favor globally when they took in millions of Syrian refugees and weighed in against Assad. But now Erdogan has basically taken on a caliph mentality and an Ottoman type mentality. The Syrians living in Turkey are realizing from what we're hearing on the ground that they are now being rejected by the Turkish government and are third, fourth class citizens. And it's actually, as far as populist movements go, is beginning to be a rejection of the AKP from whether it's Syrian immigrants or others. So I think that also is turning into the Islamists, again, over and over across the planet, are proving to be their own worst enemies when it comes to the movements they claim to be all about. Internally here in the West, if you look at pure numbers, 10 years ago, there was a study that I think it was a Gallup poll along with Abu Dhabi or one of the Emirates that looked at how many % of American Muslims adhere to ISNA, CARE, MPAC, these Islamist Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups. And at the time, we thought it was low because it was 12%. And that was a time when ISNA was able to have conventions of 40, 50,000. And they were doing that up until pre-pandemic. Now, some of this they blame on the pandemic, but clearly there has been a hemorrhaging of membership from the Islamic Society of North America and the Council on American Islamic Relations. I attribute it, and I think it's fair to attribute it to the disgrace of many of their leading Islamists, whether it's Tariq Ramadan, who was has been criticized as a serial rapist and was in prison for quite a time in France 3-4 years ago. Hassan Shibli, Florida's CARE leader, also criticized severely for sexual harassment and other issues. Numan Ali Khan, and the list goes on. There's even an organization of Muslim women attorneys called Facing Abuse in Community Environments that now has grown with hundreds of affidavits against imams and others about their sexual abuse of women that are vulnerable in mosques and elsewhere. The New York Times just had a piece a few weeks ago about sham Muslim marriages, and we're starting to see a uptick in cultural attention to some of the misogyny and other issues that are happening within the Islamist community. And so as a result, the general population of Muslims, ISNA's meeting, I think, has dropped by 80% in their last attendance numbers, and they're claiming they're doing a different format. Same thing with CARE. So I think some of their populist ability to get adherence has fallen off. That has not, however, shifted into folks adhering to our reform movement. It has basically estranged American Muslims and Western Muslims from any type of organized Muslim activity. I think that is a low-hanging fruit that will ultimately become our constituency. But I will tell you that part of the problem is those Muslim groups are those Muslim individuals are a bit too comfortable in the West, and they've not really been, I think, had the microscope about their ideology, et cetera. So there's been no urgency for them. They have basically, there's also some gaps that include gaps in education. For them to debate some of the clerics is actually a task that many in our population are not up to the task to do. They don't see imams as relevant to them because they're not controlling society, they're a minority. But there have been an increase in cases. For example, there was just now a Texas Supreme Court case that we provided an amicus brief to that just a few days ago came back in favor of the spouse that was trying to seek divorce, who she was being forced into an Islamist tribunal. And initially, the lower court insisted that she had to be forced into this coerced document that she claimed she didn't even understand what she was signing. And after a couple times at the appellate system, the Supreme Court in Texas ruled in her favor that she can have her rights heard, and that would be adhered to the American system and not according to the tribunal through a separate non-American Quranic Sharia-based system. So there are a number of these cases around the country that are having an impact on the ground as far as what Muslims perceive as being the type of system they would like to see, and thus marginalizing the ability for Islamists to have leadership. But I do think all of the corruption that you see, that in the, whether it's misogynistic corruption or corruption in their finances or otherwise, character is destiny. So the Islamist movement, I think, is beginning to fall apart. Globally, we see the Arab monarchs, or petro-Islam, is also done with Islamism. We saw just a few days ago, Arab News highlighted Qaradawi on his death. Qaradawi, by the way, Yusuf Qaradawi was basically the main central Islamic leader in the Sunni community, the Islamist Sunni community, that is, not the Salafi one, as far as the spiritual guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he passed at 96 years old. You can tell now by who provided eulogies to him as to who the diehard Muslim Islamists are in the West. But the Arab News said that he was a preacher of hate. I don't know if they would have said things similar 10, 15 years ago. There's always been an antagonism between the royal families and the Islamist movements, except in Qatar. But I do think that ultimately, and just so you understand, it's not that Wahhabi Islam has gone through a major reformation, but there's an old saying in the Middle East that the Salafis use politics for religious control, but the Islamists use religion for political control. So the Islamists are a political movement that just cloaks itself in religion, but the Salafis, the royal families, etc., will often in a corporate way use the political control they have in government and the military to exert a specific flavor of that religion that is pretty black and white and Wahhabi in nature. So these internecine battles, I think, are important to highlight and are providing a large opening for us that I think is part of the strategy that we need to look at. Many millennials are drifting away from Islam, from religion. I think Dr. Pipes had a good piece about the fact that conversions and departures from Islam are increasing. Again, as a Muslim who loves my faith, I can't feel that that's a good thing in long term, but in short term it is. I think that's how Muslims will feel an urgency to correct the corruption and the control of the political Islamists. I think ultimately the linkage globally of Palestinianism to Islamism to Islam is beginning to fall apart. and that thanks to the Abraham Accords. I just wrote a piece in the White Rose magazine I'd ask you to look at on Palestinianism and how the linkage to political Islam and Hamas and how it effectuated that globally has been the main propaganda method that they use there, and that has now been begun to fall apart because of the disconnect of Bahrain, hopefully the Saudis soon, but at least the Emirates, and hopefully more countries that will begin to de-link Palestinianism from the global Muslim Ummah or the community. In Europe, I think we've seen some successes with Sebastian Kurz in Austria, who finally declared as a Western leader that political Islam is incompatible. And actually, I think he went a bit too far in that if you're going to defeat political Islam, you do that with good ideas, better ideas, but not by outlawing it. But he did pass some, ask the parliament to pass some laws against any preaching of political Islam. So again, the diagnosis is right, but the treatment has been off. Macron has been on target as far as what the French government has been doing in targeting political Islam. And we see in Italy, Giorgia Meloni has also will soon be ascending to prime minister, and her position on the threat of Islamists, I think, will also be something for the West to learn from. I think if you look as far as in the last few minutes, what I want to talk about is what are some openings. I think the left has a template that somehow I would like to see happen with the rest of us in the West, which is if you look at what Black Lives Matter, CRT, critical race theory, a lot of the identity movements in the left, they are the last vestige that the Islamists still have significant power with in the West. And that power has basically used the Islamists to check some boxes for political Islam and the West minority type movements. But ultimately, it's given them a voice, it's given them a platform. I think in the right or center of America, as we look at, rather than the red-green axis of the left and the Islamists, a red, white, and blue axis. That red, white, and blue axis, if you saw Ilhan Omar, for example, wanted to set up a seat of an office to monitor and combat Islamophobia, which would have basically been a anti-blasphemy seat in the State Department. Thankfully, that has not made it through the Senate. I've written about that extensively, but I do think it serves to show that if we can create some positions in academia, chairs of different schools, in government to fight political Islam and to create a sense, a doctrine, if you will, that ultimately political Islam is the enemy, but liberal modern Islam is our friend, that I think just as the left template has proven to be very harmful to any reform work, I think on the right, a red, white, and blue axis defending America, defending Israel. We just had a conference with the Ruet organization that is looking at building a coalition of those who endorse the Abraham Accords. I think within that, we found a lot of Muslims that recognize Israel, and clearly has always been for us a litmus test, the recognition of Israel and belief in the friendship that America and the West has with Israel as being a litmus test of who the Islamists are and who the Islamists are not, as being key to that. So ultimately, coalitions against identity politics in the West, coalitions against anti-Semitism should evolve in the center and the center right in America, coalitions for America's foundations. And I think there needs to be, as those coalitions evolve in the political movements of the West, begin to make an effort to identify Muslims to be part of that. The problem with Muslims on the center and the right in America is that we are not organized. We are not centrally organized the way the Islamists are, of the Rashida Tlaibs and the Ilhan Omars that have a farm team. So now we need a farm team, and our farm team is part of our new project, which is about the future Muslim leaders of America. And I'll tell you, if you look, as many thousands of Islamists are part of CARE and ISNA and MPAC, at the most, you could probably come up with 30, 40 names. And I think similarly, if we can come up with 30, 40 reformists, it doesn't matter that we don't have right now the groundswell of movements that can fill up halls. The bottom line is once we have all these spokespeople with platforms in academia, government, and interfaith work, then I think that can begin to change the needle and begin to fill that gap, some of those gaps that I had talked about. So with that, I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. The first question is from Larry Greenberg. What is your estimate of the non-Islamist leanings of American Muslims?
Thank you for that question. So as far as the numbers go, I will tell you, and I believe this is informed by fact regarding, if you look at statistics in the Middle East, initially the Islamists got at max 35 to 40%. Salafists were probably 15% of that. So that leaves 50 to 60% either non-Islamists or some type of other type of political movements. And I think in the West, it's probably a little higher than that. Obviously, while many Islamists came to the West to try to evangelize their movement, many non-Islamists came to escape for freedom. So ultimately, what I've seen is, if you're talking numbers within mosques, we are a minor minority. But again, like I said, most of the non-Islamists are beginning to actually repel from organized Islam. So if you did statistics of the 5-6 million Muslims in America, I think that you'll find probably 3/4 of them reject political Islam. And that's a study that really should be done, and not be done by the pew poll type people where they're just too politically correct. I think we need some of us really heaped in this to form questions and actually finance a poll to get the numbers so that it can no longer just be guesswork.
Absolutely. And you spoke about a religious identity outside the mosque and how many or some Muslims are leaving the faith. Do you feel that Muslims feel marginalized, either the radical extremism or leave the faith?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think they're leaving definitely the organized faith much more than they were. I will tell you, even those who don't go to mosque and may not pray or fast in our holy months, they still are holding on tightly to that Muslim identity. They want their children and their grandchildren to identify as Muslims. But what does that mean? Muslim is not a race, it's an ideology. So we have to begin to educate them that it can't just be a historical tradition based on genetic transmission of a faith. It's an idea, and they have to embrace what that ideology means. But right now, I think they've been too comfortable because the media is so hell-bent on identity politics. It's amazing. I wrote a piece called Me Too, Except for Muslims, meaning that every other faith community has been all over women's rights and exposing sexual harassment and other things. And yet when it came to Muslim imams here locally in Phoenix or elsewhere, we had affidavits, lawyers that had done significant work, and I couldn't get publication of pieces that exposed that because they were worried about lawsuits and racism and other things. It's just amazing how Muslims are given a different standard of standards for evaluation than every other community. So as a result, that bigotry of low expectations creates a sense of defeatism and a lack of engagement within our community, because they do feel marginalized and not treated the way other faith communities are. In the case I helped in Texas, I provided expert witness testimony for her case. I can tell you the judge, initially, the lower court judge just dismissed me, was more respectful to the imam on the other side than she was to me during the questioning. But then the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in our favor versus the imam's favor.
That's interesting that you mentioned the court case. We've actually had another speaker mention that the reverence for the religion over individual security. Has that been happening more often, do you think?
Yeah, and here's the quandary. The quandary is, I'm a conservative. I believe our federal government should stay as much out of religious issues as possible. It's a very personal decision. And if faith communities, whether Christian, Jewish, or otherwise, want to have their own arbitration system, that's fine. But when a religious document says that explicitly they reject the laws of the land, they reject the Constitution, and the Quran will take precedence, that's the role for protection of rights. That's why our Constitution exists. So unfortunately, the Muslim consciousness in America is still where the separation of church and state discussion was when our founding fathers had the discussion of the Establishment Clause, versus where the political spectrum in America is in the 21st century about discussion of church and state, whether it's on pro-life issues and other things. That's a 21st century conversation with progressivists versus conservatives. And we mix and end up using Muslims for a political discourse in America rather than really understanding where our community is. So, and I've had the same issue on school choice. The Islamic schools in America, as you saw with TISA and that was shut down in Minneapolis and other schools, are often separatist and anti-American and might as well be, I see them as supremacist schools akin to having a Nazi school in America. And yet they're given deference for religious freedom because nobody wants to harm the school choice movement. So we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, which is protect school choice, but yet be critical of Islamic schools that are separatist in their ideology.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. JL asks, is there any effort to get the news media to start seeking input from moderate Muslims versus the cares of the world?
I think they're going to be dragged kicking and screaming, as we saw anytime the media groupthink, especially on the left, is called out. But we don't need them. I think many of our reformists have large platforms. We could get to alternative media through podcasts. Imagine if Joe Rogan, Barry Weiss, so many others now that have their own platforms would begin to highlight our work regularly in the reform movement. It would make traditional media completely irrelevant as they have in their own platforms. So I think there's other opportunities. The problem is they see the Islamic issue as not necessarily high priority. I would say if you have other issues, whatever the top 5 priorities are against the identity politics, CRT, BLM left, put Muslims into that. We have people that are advocating for support of our military, support of our Constitution and our rights and other things that are a debate in the core political discourse in America. Just make sure there's Muslims that can become icons that are seen in American culture as part of that debate. No different than the Tlaibs and the the squad included Muslims. I don't think they did it because they cared about jihad one way or the other. It was because they included them as part of the diversity mix.
And a follow up to that, obviously, you're one of the leaders of the reform movement here that you're speaking about. But who else has a voice like yours?
So our reform movement includes many leaders in Europe, Canada, and the US. Many of you may, for example, know Ezra Nomani. She, I think, as an example of what I was just saying, and that she was very active in the school parent rights issues over the past few years, and yet she maintained significant work with us in the reform movement. Raheel Raza in Toronto has been very engaged in her work with Muslims for a better tomorrow. Soraya Dean has been very active from the Sri Lanka community and on women's rights in Europe. We've been working closely with Imam Usama Hassan, and he's been actually very much engaged in some of the theological discourse with our Muslim Reform Movement. And so if you go to muslimreformmovement.org, you'll see a list of many of them that are on there. I'd also call your attention to a new coalition we're broadening beyond the Muslim community, which is called Clarity Coalition, which is Champions for Liberty against the reality of Islamist terror. And that Islamism, that anti-Islamist coalition, we're broadening to include so many like the Middle East Forum and others in the anti-jihad movement so that we can begin to develop those coalitions I was talking about in my opening remarks.
Yes, and in your opening remarks, you also stated the ball is in the court of the reformists. But Ed Blum asks, what do you suggest a non-Muslim can or should do?
So I would ask that when you see things that are at the top of the agenda, for example, free speech. Right now, there's a lot of discussion on what speech limitations should exist on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and what should be canceled or not canceled and cancel culture. Include Muslims in that conversation. I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen major media talk about cancel culture, and there's nothing about what we're experiencing. You saw the assassination attempt of Salman Rushdie a few months ago. And there was hardly, I mean, there was some coverage, but compared to what would have been covered 5-6 years ago, I think it was still minimal. And yet that attack on a hero like Salman Rushdie brought to confluence issues regarding Iran, Hezbollah, free speech, cancel culture, all these things that are part of the media that should have been, we could have had 7, 8 of us speaking about this, and none of us really got too much calls despite our press releases, et cetera. Second, in politics, I think talk to your members of Congress about engaging these issues, having hearings about them, and keeping it on the agenda of Congress, especially when it comes to foreign policy formulation. Keeping the ball moving on the Abraham Accords, I think, is really important, that I think move the ball forward significantly. Lastly, in academia, insist that your local universities have us on panels. Actually, we don't want to displace the Islamists. I'd love to debate them, because whenever we do, they lose a lot more following and we gain more. So make sure we have presence in universities, and actually also possibly begin to get, just like MESA, the Middle East Association of America, which is a horrifically Islamist and Arabist institution, we need to form similar types of networks within the university academia structure of anti-Islamists and reformists.
Thank you. And we have quite a few questions. Unfortunately, we do not have time for, but before we go, can you tell our viewers where we can find some more of your work?
So find me at our website with the American Islamic Forum for Democracy at aifdemocracy.org. And find me on Twitter is the easiest way, at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DrZuhdi Jasser, and also MuslimReformMovement.org. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Jasser, for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
For our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.